Thank you very much for coming this evening. This is the third year in a row. My name is Dan Simpson and I've been on Ascension for a few years now and primarily been involved in the Shark project in the last few years. I'm joined with a few colleagues of mine from the Exeter University, and across the bottom here you'll see the project partners that we've had from the beginning of the project. So this is the third year that we've had the opportunity to present the data for the Ascension Island Shark project. So it's very exciting for us all. These are some of the team members from ZSL, University of Windsor, University of Exeter, AIG, and also University of Plymouth. I don't think I've left anyone out there. So Nige Hussey, Professor Nige Hussey in the top left, Dr. Sam Webber, PhD candidate Lucy Clarke, who's both here tonight. This guy you might know, Tiff, the Director of Conservation, Matt Golick, Claire Collins, Phil Hosegood, and Dave Koenig. These guys all represent various project partners that without them this would not be possible. But the most important people to make this possible is my team. So I need to thank those guys first and foremost, because we put ourselves out there to collect data, to turn over equipment, and without you guys, past, present, and future, none of this would be possible. So thank you very much. So what we'll go through is the changes that we have observed that has created the project that the Darwin funded initially, which was approximately 2 years of funding. So we went through a very intensive period of collecting data, deploying equipment, and trying to monitor and understand the shark movements and activity. Also, a major international issue that we're trying to understand is how people and wildlife can interact. Often there's a conflict or a collision because of space use or occupied area, say the marine world, where we will have a conflict or some sort of interaction, if you will, with some sort of wildlife. So if you go terrestrial, you'll say like farming and wild boar. If you go to the marine world, it's depredation on trying to fish for tuna, for example, and you may interact with sharks. So there's always the possibility of some sort of interaction. So that's how it's impacting people, and it can be impacting people from all realms. So for example, from a commercial side of things, so if you're a tourism industry and all of a sudden your tourism base evaporates because you no longer have a safer beach to swim at, well, that impacts a lot of different entities. So this is understanding how, on Ascension Island, how it can impact people. And obviously we want to use what we learn or what we have, and going forward what we need to learn and what we need to have in the knowledge base. So like I said, I'm joined tonight by Sam and Lucy. They're amazing project partners that we've had over the last few years, and they'll each share various parts of the information that we're here tonight to see. So we hopefully by the end of the evening or by the end of the session we'll have at the very least more questions for next time we come back to answer. So please store all the questions in mind and hold them for the end of the session. Last time we were here, we had some amazing questions, and I still remember a few of those. They were head scratchers. So please, I want some more of those. Yeah. So basically, how are the sharks interacting with humans, and is this normal? How is this impacting life on the island? How are the sharks moving around the island? This is a very nice, Sam's been working on some beautiful images of how this is happening, and I'm excited to see that as well. And what is causing these movements, and yeah, I would like to hand over to Lucy.
Hello. Oh, yes, perfect. All right, so picking up from where Dan's left off, one of the first objectives of the study was to understand the impact of human-shark interactions on the residents living on Ascension Island. So just to kind of recap some of the results that we found from that. So a couple of years back, you might have met Clarke, who was here, conducting some interviews with us, and basically tried to reach as wide a cross-section of the island as possible to find out how sharks were impacting day-to-day life and how those interactions were feeding into kind of how people felt about ocean use. And from those interviews a couple of years ago, the analysis is basically suggesting that sharks make it unsafe to go in the water on Ascension. That's how people are feeling, given that roughly 80% there either agree or strongly agree with that statement. That being said, there is a very wide diversity of opinion there, and some people obviously don't feel the same. But some of the themes that came out of that were that, you know, people wouldn't let their children play in the water, and people felt generally more unsafe using the water when there was periods of heightened inshore shark presence. So beneath that, more specifically in terms of how inshore shark presence is impacting day-to-day lives, these were some of the key themes that came out. So kind of more widely, that enjoyment of living on Ascension has been negatively impacted, stopped engaging in social occasions or traditions, going fishing less, enjoyment of the ocean being decreased, or losing money. So there were some interviews that suggested that depredation could be 100% at times, which obviously has kind of financial implications of losing those lures. And then, you know, the vast majority of respondents in those interviews also said that they use the ocean less, which is tough to hear, really. And I think following on from that, one of the themes that emerged was that there was kind of this unpredictable nature of interactions, that it wasn't necessarily that it was the certainty of coming across a shark in the water, it was the unpredictability of when they were going to be inshore and that kind of lack of clarity, I suppose. So following on from Claire's interviews, the thing we wanted to get at was, is this normal for Ascension Island? Has this happened in the past? And have we seen those recurring kind of cycles of inshore shark presence? This kind of supports that in terms of this wide diversity of opinion on Ascension of, are these interactions normal? And I think the amount of time spent on Ascension varies quite widely. There's a high turnover of people, so sometimes you can lose that kind of, I guess, like institutional memory of what's happened in the past. So it's quite hard to get a baseline understanding of if this has happened recently or much further back in the past. So we took a multi-pronged approach to try and get at whether these interactions have been happening before, but just in a time period that maybe isn't kind of as recollected as easily on Ascension Island. So the first step was to basically scour through all of Ascension Island's archives, and also using the interviews that were conducted, social media texts that we could find. We also issued an online survey to try and target people who had previously lived on Ascension, which basically spat out this graph, which, if I can just talk you through, we see this really interesting peak in a lack of sightings in the orange here, starting about the 1970s and going through the 2010s, which is complemented by down here, if you see, in the 1990s. Never saw them when I was there in the early 90s. Like, there's quite a lot of references that you can find on social media, for example, and in those online surveys where people who had lived on the island for years hadn't actually had many interactions with sharks. So whilst it seems quite a regular thing these days, historical text does seem to suggest that that's not always been the case. That being said, if you look further back, there are also kind of the cycles on the flip side, for example, of the dark blue, where sharks have been frequently sighted, which kind of references much further back in the century. So you can see, you know, 1928, the water also swarms with sharks. So you see these cycles over much longer timescales, as well as the cycles you're seeing kind of within the year now coming towards the pierhead. So this is kind of taking a wide view of what the last century can tell us, and then going a little bit more narrow. So how about the last decade? Do we see cycles over the shorter time frame? So for this, we basically just used social media posts. So we scraped posts referencing sharks on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and pulled out any images that had a shark within them. And that spat out this lovely graph. So you can see what we were hearing anecdotally through those interviews and what we've kind of been reading on social media was reflected in just processing those images. So you've got this spike in 2016 of posts on social media featuring sharks. preceding the 2 shark bites which happened here in 2017, and then you kind of get this drop off and cycle again, peaking back up in 2021. And the black line above it shows within an image that has been scraped off social media the maximum number of sharks in that year. So you've got a high peak here in 2022 of almost 20 sharks within one image. So you do see these cycles kind of over the last century, but also over the last decade as well. And then going even more fine scale, we have you might have seen it, a time-lapse camera situated at both the Pierhead and Comfortless Cove. And this is taking a still image every 10 minutes. And what we then do is download all that massive data, go through it and basically categorize how many sharks were in each image, which is what this graph is showing us. So this is 2024 from January through to December. And it's basically, again, showing us this clear cycle of inshore shark presence across July and August, which was matching up with what we've been hearing anecdotally on the island. But it's a really nice way of us trying to kind of establish this much more systematic way of capturing these inshore movements, which we can then continue over a longer time frame to understand how those kind of vary year on year. But yeah, you can see that kind of, very low levels of activity from January through to April, and then, kind of spikes of up to 8 sharks within one image around July and August, which is shown in that kind of image up there. So I guess the take home from that sort of the last century, the last decade, the last year, these cycles have been happening across very different timescales for a very long time. And the next step really is to try and understand why. And I think to do that, we've needed to have a more systematic monitoring process in place, which leads us on to our shark project around Ascension in terms of tagging sharks and monitoring them in a more systematic way. So the sharks that we have tagged around Ascension are the Galapagos shark and the silky shark. The ones you've probably seen down at the Pierhead are the Galapagos, and kind of it's very hard to tell them apart. Even I really struggle, but generally the silky sharks have a bit of a bronzy tinge to them. The pec fin is swept much further back, and there's not as much overlap between the pec and the dorsal fin. So over the last couple of years, we've tagged 43 Galapagos sharks and 14 silky sharks, and we got 7 more last Friday, which was a record for how many we got in one day. So that was a very exciting day out on the water. So we've got a nice sample size of sharks tagged around the island. And the way it works is that these sharks are tagged with an acoustic transmitter, which looks like this. So it's pretty small. And this is surgically implanted into a cavity. So we flip them upside down, make a really small incision, pop this in and stitch them up alongside the boat. And then this basically sends out a signal every 3 to 5 minutes. And if that shark is next to one of these, when this pings, this receiver will log that detection and store it. These are moored down on the bottom of the ocean. And so that will log those detections. Then when we come back year on year, we pull these up and download all that data. So we can see which shark, because these have a unique ID, which is the critical bit. So we know which shark has passed which receiver and when. So we get a date and a timestamp from the unique ID, and then we can see, okay, this shark has passed through this receiver on this date and time. So that's kind of the crux of how our acoustic telemetry system works. So this is a shot of our colleague Nige Hussey pulling a shark alongside the boat. Before it's flipped upside down, it has one of these popped in it. And this is what our array of receivers looks like around the island. So we've got 31 in total. 21 of these are offshore, which are the little blue spots, located roughly on the 100-metre isobath. And then we have some key kind of inshore sites as well, so the 10 inshore receivers and the little orange dots, mostly dotted around the west and north coast, which gives us a really nice kind of fine-scale coverage of where these sharks are at any one point. They've got a detection range of about 800 metres, so if a shark is within 800 metres of that receiver, you should be picking up that shark's ID. And this is what it has given us in a kind of very high-level summary format. So we've had those receivers in the water now for 3 years. So we've got the first year of data on the far left, the second year in the middle, the third year on the far right. The red diamond indicates when the shark was tagged. So you can see in that first year we tagged the kind of first bunch. And we could see from pulling back that first year of data that these sharks are highly resident. They weren't really leaving the island. There's a few that have left and moved off, but generally they were staying around the island, and even though they may not have been in the areas where you were seeing them around the pierhead, they were around the island somewhere. A bit of a different case for the silkies, which are the ones down here. So I should have said that the top one is the Galapagos and the bottom here is the silkie. Different case for the silkie, which seem to move off much more readily, don't hang around for long, occasionally pop back. So each of these blue dots is a detection. So you can see in the second year, again, we tagged a bunch more sharks, still fairly highly resident, a few moving off. But then in the third year, we seem to have a bit of a different pattern where quite a lot left the array. And it seemed to be kind of around August time last year. So with that being said, I think we'll get into the juicy stuff of why.
Okay, so residency. A lot of the sharks that we tagged stayed around the island, quite high residency levels. That was really important information in itself, because one of the theories when we started this project was maybe these like large numbers of sharks people were seeing around the island were coming from elsewhere. They were coming in from offshore into the island. That was an idea that was put out there. We were quite readily able to discount that. Although some sharks do leave and go elsewhere, by and large, it's the same sharks staying around the island. They're the ones you're seeing at the pierhead, but you're not always seeing them. So that begs the question where they're going when they're not around the island. So this comes to a kind of the movement part of our project, trying to understand the dynamics, how they're moving around the island, and how do those movements, and when and where do those movements bring them into contact with people. So that's what I'm going to go through now. So although we have lots of conversations with people at the pierhead, we talk to people in the bars, we know when people interact with sharks, we get reports of it. It's quite anecdotal information. It's quite hard to get good quantitative information on when people are running into sharks and where they're running into them. So we use a slightly different approach to get this information, which we needed. And as part of those interviews that Lucy mentioned at the start, where we interviewed people on the island, we got them to draw on paper maps the kind of places around the island they use for activities like boat fishing or rock fishing or swimming, snorkeling, that kind of thing. They annotated the maps, and we got about 30 of them, and we were then able to distill all that information down and produce a map of the key bits of the island that people use. And you all know this, it's all the bits that people recognise as kind of key fishing spots, key swimming spots. But we needed that as a layer that we could then compare the movements of our sharks to, so we could see when they were in the bits that mattered to people. So that's what the output of the participatory mapping looks like, and you'll see these core use areas in the plots that are going to come now. So let's go on to what's been happening with the shark movement. So I'm just going to tell you before I start playing this is like a video showing you what our sharks have done over 3 years. I'm going to explain what we're going to see in each part of this. So this top part here is a heat map, and the kind of yellower, brighter colours show you where our shark activity is concentrated. So all the little black crosses around the island are all of our receivers that we're detecting the sharks on, and the heat map is going to show you where our tagged sharks are hanging out. You can see the dotted line is those kind of key bits used by people that came from our mapping exercise, so that's the key human bit. And down here, it's going to trace along and show you how the overlap between our tagged sharks and people is changing over time. So as soon as they come into this area, we have an index that lets us measure from 0 to 1 how much our sharks are overlapping with human use areas, so we can track this over time. So let's just play this and hope and pray that this works. So when we started the project, you can see all the sharks were basically hanging out down on the south coast, particularly around Pillar Bay down here in this corner. And our shark-human overlap index is low. They weren't really in the bits people use at all. And then you can see as we get into November, December 23, they start to push around this corner, particularly around Pan Am, and we get a peak in human-shark overlaps. Then it goes down again. They all sort of retreat a bit more towards the south coast. And then as we get into the kind of summer, July, August, September, we get another big spike as they move around the corner, sort of past Pan Am and off Georgetown. And then they entered into a very stable state after that. And for the past year up until about kind of September last year, they were just hanging out on the south coast again around Pillar Bay for a long time, about 12 months they spent around there. And then in the middle of last year, sort of September time, October time, you can see big spikes on, a really huge spike in November last year as they all wrapped around the top of the island and came into the human use bits. And it stayed in a kind of semi-sharky state, I'd say, since then. And people have been recognising that at the pierhead. There have been sharks around, not loads, but we've stayed in a kind of semi-sharky position. So this index here is kind of a crude index of human-shark kind of interaction potential. We don't know that people were interacting with sharks at those times, But from chatting to people at these relevant periods, it seems to line up pretty well. We know around these periods, lots of people were losing lures. We know around here, you guys have been seeing a lot of sharks around the pierhead recently, and particularly just before Christmas. So it seems to line up quite well with the kind of anecdotal reports we're getting from people. And this was like a critical first stage in our project, because in order to understand why this is happening and why sharks are coming into contact with people around the side, we need a good way of quantifying their movements over time and understanding where they are when they're not around Georgetown or the pierhead and elsewhere, and when they're coming around and coming into contact with people. Okay, so that is 3 years of data, and I'm going to break it down in a slightly kind of easier to understand way now, looking at different periods of shark activity that we had. It's the same kind of information, heat map of where they were, and kind of 5 really distinct phases that have happened over the 3 years of the project. Phase 1, long period at the start, all down on the south coast of the island. And I'm going to use my little pointer here because I can. All hanging out on the south coast. Phase 2, they start to spread around. They go into a kind of dispersed state. They're in lots of different places, but coming in a bit into the human use area on this coast, but they don't love this side of the island. They kind of dip round, but they're kind of spread all around. Phase 3, again, quite spread out all around, dipping into the kind of key bits that you guys use at the north and south. Phase 4, long phase, they all go back to the south again, hanging out around Pillar Bay. And then phase 5, they do the same thing again. They spread out and come right the way around the island using lots of different sites. So the answer to the question of where they are when they're not kind of in the bits that people use is they're on the south coast, and they tend to be hanging out around Pillar Bay, which is a site they absolutely love. And I hope we've got a video that will play now so you can see what it looks like at Pillar Bay when they are all there. And we call this the Super School. And there are really a huge number of sharks down that site in a very small area. It's maybe, what, like 500 metres across, a kilometre across, but thousands of sharks on it. So that is where they tend to be hanging out when they're not around this side of the island. And so the cause of the kind of movements around to this coast seem to be a breakdown in this super school. This is kind of where they normally are, and at times this school fragments and it goes all around the island to different places. And the key thrust of our project now is trying to understand why that happens. We call it fission fusion dynamics. They come together in one spot, that big school breaks down and they spill around everywhere. That's when you see them, then they go back in their big school again. And this is the thing, I mean, this is an incredible edge. And it was like this again when we were around there on Friday. It was getting back towards this state. So I think they are now moving off, and it looked like the super school was reforming again. So what is causing this? And this is like, if you like, ongoing goal, but is kind of the next stage for our project, because as I'm going to show you now, it's not easy to explain why this is happening and why that school is breaking down and moving out. But we'll do our best to tell you what we've found out so far. So in those interviews at the very start of the project, when we first talked to people, we wanted to get a sense from the people on the island what they thought was causing the movements to happen, to give us a few kind of things to investigate. These are the answers we got. The number one thing that people thought was causing it was wide oceanographic or climate changes in the ocean, so changes in currents or changes in temperature that were causing them to leave that site and go elsewhere. And this was our kind of favourite theory as well. It seems to be most likely based on what we know about shark ecology elsewhere. So this is kind of where we started our investigation into what's causing it. So to do this, as well as our shark receivers that Dan showed you before in the water, we have a whole bunch of oceanographic monitoring equipment. We've had 4 or 5 different current measuring devices around the island called acoustic Doppler current profilers that measure the currents around the island. We've had long strings of temperature loggers that you can see up here that come right the way through the water column and let us measure the temperature from the surface right the way down to the seabed, so we can see what the kind of water's doing at different depths. And I'll show you now how we've kind of taken that and related it to those metrics of human-shark overlap that I showed you before, to see if we can find any patterns that might explain why they're around here at certain times. So there's that graph showing all the kind of sharky periods, these peaks when they were around on this side of the island. This is what the currents have been doing around the island over the same time. And it's a little bit hard to understand, but this hopefully helps explain what's going on. So all the kind of greeny colours means the currents coming kind of from the east and the north. The pinky colours means the currents coming from the west, this way. And you can see on the whole, the currents at Ascension flow this way, basically. In the South Equatorial Current, the currents kind of go from the east towards the west. Every now and again, though, you get these like really strong flips where the current goes zip and flips around the other way and it comes from the west. And it's probably caused by these big whirlpools, essentially big eddies that cross over the island. They're like tens to hundreds of kilometres wide and they spin across the Atlantic and they can cause the current very quickly to flip the other way. And until we had this year of data, we got quite excited because the big peaks in sharkiness kind of here and here seemed to line up and come shortly after very strong current flips coming from the west side that was pushing all the currents onshore around Georgetown on this coast. And we thought, bingo, we've absolutely nailed this mechanism. Now we can write this up and be famous. Unfortunately, this year that has not happened. We've got another very strong shift happen in the kind of middle of last year, but the peak in sharkiness didn't happen until probably 3, 4, 5 months after that. So that was a bit of a back to the drawing board moment. But we're not going to totally rule this out yet. I'll explain why in a moment. There could be multiple affect happening here that's going to cause shocks. So this is not going to be an on-off button and one thing will cause it. So there was some pattern sort of emerging there. It's not held this year. We need more years of data to see if we can find replicating cycles in these currents, and we're going to keep doing that. We've also been collecting, as I say, data on the temperature of the water through the water columns. So this shows you the depth of the water on the left-hand side over here. And how red or blue it is how warm the water is. As you go down, you can see like clear cycles and how warm the water is around Ascension over time, over seasons. And this blue line on the bottom is tracing the 23-degree kind of contour, if you like, so you can see it moving up and down at depth. As well as monitoring where sharks are going horizontally around the island, our tags also tell us how deep they are, so we can see when they're deep, when they're shallow. And for this, we get a much stronger kind of oceanographic signal. Hopefully this will play. Here's our average shark every day of the year, and you can see them kind of tracking that 23-degree isopath. They kind of go shallow, and then they start to come down. As the water goes warm at depth, they come down, and they're like, oh, it's cold, it's cold, it's cold, it's cold, they come up again. As the water gets cold, as the water gets warm, you're going to see them start to track down again into the deeper water when it's the kind of temperature they like. Then it gets cold again here, and up they come again, and they follow the cold water up. So for the depth of the sharks, we get like really strong predictability, and we kind of expected that. We know that sharks have like a favorite temperature kind of niche that they occupy, and they very commonly track water temperature up and down. So this is important for human interactions too. Obviously, you're more likely to meet a shark when you're fishing if it's shallow than when it's very deep down in the water column, and we have got good predictability of that going on. And actually, we've just started to notice patterns in particularly this at the bottom where you get these like really cold water spikes start to come up. There seems to be some relationship between that happening and when they're around this side of the island as well, but it's kind of a weak pattern at the moment. But we're going to do some more investigation into what might be happening there as that kind of cold water pushes up. And during those kind of cold water upwelling times, they seem to like it around on the south, which might suggest that makes it good to be around there. But work in progress on that one. Okay, so I'm going to quickly talk you through around our next steps. What I really wanted by now in the project was to be able to tell you guys, like, definitively, this is what is causing the sharks to move around. We can predict it for you. We can tell you when it's going to happen. We can look ahead and give you a shark forecast for when it's going to come, but we are not close to that at the moment. And I think it was probably naive in a way because these are very complicated systems that these sharks are inhabiting. We're looking at ocean currents, but sharks are at the top of the food chain, and between what's happening in the ocean and a shark, there is lots of levels of trophic levels happening from plankton to small fish to big fish to the prey of the sharks. And the sharks are probably mainly following the prey rather than what the current's doing. So there's a lot of intermediate steps there that we need to try and understand. And this is one of the things that people on the island also identified as their second most popular, changes in other fish populations as causing these movements of sharks. Now that could mean changes in the abundance of other fish species, but these movements are changing, like shark distributions are changing very rapidly, which suggests that fish populations probably aren't changing like that. But it could also be the distribution of other fish populations. When the prey moves around to this side, the sharks follow the prey. So I think kind of our next line of inquiry is going to be looking a bit more at what these sharks are eating and trying to track them as well and understand how the sharks are following the food. And if we work back that way, it will give us slightly more insights into where these movements are coming from. This is kind of ongoing work, but at the moment we're doing some diet work on the sharks. We've got a few different methods we use. We're collecting tissue samples, you can see down here, from every shark that we tag, and we can analyse those for different compounds called stable isotopes, for example, that let us trace what they've been eating with like molecular tracers. We are collecting cloacal swabs. We basically stick a swab into the shark's bottom and swizzle it round, and using that we can like look at the genetics of what it's been eating, so we can sequence DNA found in their poo, essentially, or around their cloacas. And that will tell us what they've been eating as well. That's work that Mel is doing in conservation. And we're also taking kind of broad like condition measures, like how good condition are the sharks in that we're catching? Are they fat? Are they thin? By collecting like morphological measurements. And we might find out they come around this side when they're starving, for example, and they stay on the south when they're all fat and happy. So that might tell us a bit more about what's causing the movements too. Once we know what they're eating up here, we're then going to try and do some work on how that prey is moving. We need to know what it is first. We have some good leads, and hopefully going into the next year of tracking, we're going to start putting out tags on things like jacks or tuna, so we can see how their movements compare to what we're seeing the sharks doing, and that might be a stronger signal because we expect sharks to follow those big prey species. And so we're really hoping to engage the community, particularly the fishing community, in doing that. We need people to help us get the fish to tag, so particularly boat fishermen. We're hoping we can get those guys on board to help us catch fish and put tags on things like tuna and jacks, which we'll track on the same array in the same way as the sharks. And this is like a little interesting kind of aside, I suppose, but an extension of the project. So we're obviously mainly interested here in what the sharks around Ascension are doing, but we have this big listening station in the ocean now which can detect tags put in any fish anywhere in the world. A lot of people use these same tags and they put them in different species, and we can detect their fish too. The chance of it happening is very low because it's a very big ocean and there aren't many fish tagged. But we have so far managed to detect 6 other fish tagged elsewhere in the world that have either come to Ascension or our animals have gone to their islands instead. So there's quite a lot of movement happening around in the South Atlantic. So we had, for example, one of our Galapagos sharks, we just got this news last week, was detected in St. Paul's Rocks up in Brazil. So we know they're resident, but Lucy said a lot of them seemed to leave last year. And it seems like dispersal events happen and they move off Ascension and they just vanish off our array forever. And this one has gone 2,000 kilometres up to St. Paul's Rocks in Brazil. We found out as well last week, this is a detection from this year, that we had an Almaco jack tagged in Centolina 2 years ago, turned up last year on Ascension Island. It swam 1,300 kilometres from Centolina to here. And we've had a whole bunch of sharks, I think 4 sharks now, that have moved from the seamounts of Ascension Island that we tagged sharks on many years ago, sort of 6-7 years ago, that have been showing up fairly regularly around Ascension as well. So these animals are moving over quite long distances, and this is not so important for like the shark problem on Ascension Island, but it's kind of contributing to bigger conservation goals in the Atlantic, if you like, trying to understand how our species that live here move across bigger spaces and how we might need to work together with other countries to protect those species if we want to do conservation. And I think that's the end of my bit. I was going to hand over to you, Dan, just to like wrap up and where we go from here.
Yeah. So much like last year, what we'll have is in 12 months' time again, we'll have the receiver array, the equipment that you've seen. We have to pull all that back again, and we have to service it and put it back down. This is not a short-term, one-and-done kind of deal. Long-term, as Sam and Lucy have alluded to, it's long-term. So you can make inferences or assumptions based on very short-term, but it's very dangerous. And it's important. We have some funding, and hopefully we'll have some more in the future, to keep rolling over the receiver array, to keep tagging sharks, to keep getting project partners, or sorry, other countries really, on board with what we're trying to do, because it's a greater Atlantic issue at the moment and going forward. So what we have is a beautiful MPA with amazing wildlife. Marine wildlife and terrestrial, I won't forget terrestrial. But once you get outside of that, as we've seen with that massive migration, is you enter an area of vulnerability. So it's important that we continue to understand our own population and then expand that to the greater population. And that's where we need buy-in from other areas around the world. So it's important that we keep going. These tags, those little tiny tags that you saw, the battery life is good for 10 years. So you've got automatically a 10-year lifespan on the tagged animal. You just need to return your receivers to the water to keep going with monitoring, and that's all money. So we have 12 more months now. We've just returned over the array, and Sam will be back next year. Lucy will be writing up all of her PhD. Our team will be ready to go again next year. I did forget 2 other areas or groups that I meant to thank also. As one, also none of this would be possible without our other departments within AIG, Ascension Island Government, so the Marine team especially, the Marine Ops team. They help us all the time, and also the volunteers. So the volunteers that we've had over the years, thank you very much. And thank you all again for coming tonight. So We'll be back here again next year, and there will be literature that hopefully will be trickling through the next few years that will be reporting on all the findings, and each year we'll have another set of questions that we hope to answer and develop. So with that, could I open it to yourselves, and if you have any questions, please, Sam's going.
So we're cabin crew for our tanker, and we've been coming to this island since 2013, and when we was there back then, the Galapagos was known to be safe. So we was able to go into the sea. We swam with the Galapagos sharks. I don't know, are they safe generally, or?
It is a very good question, and it's like saying, is your household dog safe? You know, today it is, tomorrow. You just don't know sometimes. But I will refer to Sam on maybe extending that answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a common question about lots of shark species, and the answer is they're not a species that's really known to be aggressive to people. Sharks, bites by Galapagos sharks are exceptionally rare, but there obviously have been 2 examples here, and since then there's been an abundance of caution. But if you look globally, no, not really. They're not known to do it. They're not one of the sort of top 3 species known to bite people. What we have observed here, though, is kind of short but very abrupt changes in behaviour. Like, they're generally very benign. I've dived with Galapagos sharks here many, many times. Like, snorkeled with them, scubaed with them, absolutely fine. There's many videos on YouTube of people like spearfishing around them. They don't interact, but just sometimes they seem to flip into a very aggressive state, and people see this at the at the pierhead with them, like attacking cans in the water or attacking anything that floats. Our theory is that they're just incredibly hungry when that happens. Like, starvation kicks in essentially in the population. And our original theory of what is driving them around is the things that push them in. They don't want to be in the shallow water around the pierhead. We know they like to be deep down at Pillar Bay. That's kind of where they normally are. But when that food dries up, and if the sharks start to starve, we think they might get pushed into shallower areas, maybe looking for food, and they go into this slightly more inquisitive, slightly more aggressive state, and that's when they're potentially dangerous. And so it is right to have that abundance of caution, I think, particularly during those times when they're known to be active around inshore areas. But I'd say when they're not in those inshore areas, we know they're elsewhere, and people have been snorkeling and diving quite happily for a large part of last year without any kind of interactions with sharks at all, because they were elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thanks. Could the sharks coming to the shallow areas, could that be memory? From how old do they live? Could it, so say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they'd got fish, throw straight over the side. Is that memory?
Like habituation kind of signal to getting fed there.
Yeah.
We are quite interested in the level of the individualness of the movements, and it's something we've not really got into yet. Is it the same sharks that are always moving into inshore areas? And Lucy's just started doing some. I mean, I can let you talk about your next PhD chapter if you want. Yeah, and you can shed some light on that.
So it's a bit of a work in progress, but we're basically trying to unravel whether the groups that sharks move off into when they move away from that kind of Pillar Bay side, whether that's kind of more socially driven than environmentally driven. I think it's at that kind of individual level point, is that they're following a specific shark? Is it the same group that's always moving around into kind of Georgetown area? And I guess very, very preliminary findings seems to be that you've got these sharks that when they break out from that kind of Pillar Bay area, there's the group that like to go to kind of down towards Pan Am, there's the group that like to go off to Bosenberg. Like, they seem quite set in their areas, they've got quite high levels of site fidelity to where they like to go back to, which indicates that it might be the same sharks returning round to the pithead in these kind of states when they disaggregate. That is kind of needs more investigation, but that's kind of the way it kind of is heading at the moment. So it might be that it is kind of more individuals that are kind of frequenting this site, and there are some that just never come around to it, but we don't yet know.
It's a good question, Rich, because also, if I could add to that, is if you're a juvenile shark and your foraging ground is, say, like a mangrove or somewhere coastal, and that's kind of like, where you remember being like safe for food or comfortable to forage, possibly you might come back. There is other studies that have done cognitive mapping in tiger sharks and in various other species, so they'll see a trend and they'll use thousands of kilometers. So they'll see distinct pattern of migration. So there is learning and cognitive mapping in animals, just like goldfish. If you know, apparently they don't have a memory, but they know how to feed, right? They come up to the surface, they know where you're
I just
feeding.
think along predator lines, they remember groups. They don't remember
Possibly,
where to
yeah,
go
yeah.
at certain stages of.
I'm sure there's an individual level to this behaviour, and we'll find it is similar shot. I suppose, like, underlying your question is also this idea that maybe it was fishing and chumming and baiting around the pierhead that caused the shark movement.
I'm also thinking
And
turtles.
it was a theory, and it was one we had to investigate. I think it's highly unlikely, and we've largely discounted it now because those movements have continued to happen since we started this project, and the baiting and chumming that happened sort of back in, you know, the kind of pre-COVID years hasn't been happening over that time. They've kept doing it. Lucy's work over kind of much longer timescales, decadal timescales. People were seeing those same rapid shifts when sharks weren't here, then they were here, then they were here. So, and across that whole period, fishing effort has been the same. There's always been people fishing. There's been people discarding off the pierhead. The sharks have still been not there and then there again. So we don't believe at all that this is a thing that's been caused by one or two fishermen chumming with certain baits and causing this to happen. It's a much bigger, island-wide, like environmentally driven phenomenon that we're seeing, not a simple like.
So does the data
following
match
theme
up
thing.
with turtle activity in and out, and the good young ones as well? Because I did notice your graph. You said that the in the summer, but actually it's our winter.
Yeah. Yeah. So far we can see
So
no
you
seasonality.
You see there's activity in the summer months in December and January, in November, which is when when the big turtles are coming in.
There have been three.
And the winter ones is when the
Three major
turtles
ones.
are coming out.
Yeah, three major ones. They happen. Two of them have happened between like November and January, and then one of them happened like July, August, September. So at the moment we can't see
So
any
that's
like
summer and winter.
both times a year. So that's another, we can't find any seasonality in that either at the moment. And I don't think it's driven by a simple seasonal switch like that. It's not driven by a simple on-off current. It's more
So would it be
complicated
temperature and turtles.
things plus something else
Yeah,
plus
yeah, I
something
know,
else.
it's never
and
ever one thing.
no,
Yeah.
No.
very complicated levels
Thank,
to it. But
thank
we'll
you for your question. That's
get
good.
Sorry, mate, I'll keep one.
No, all good. Thanks, Rich.
Did you monitor any big offshore fishing ships that was coming close during those times? Like make the sharks like hear the sound and move around or something?
I don't believe there would be any big fishes because it's been MPA the entire time we've been doing this.
Yeah,
and
but if you got no police, that's just like saying
We-
like you got no police to police this road, it will just go all out.
Yeah. But so there is kind of enforcement on the MPA here, satellite based. Obviously, there's not a boat out looking for fishing vessels, but satellite enforcement tells us that the fishing boats are obeying the MPA and they are complying with it and they're staying on the periphery of it fishing. Certainly, there's been no evidence of any boats coming close enough to this island to affect.
So could they
The distribution
switch
of
their
sharks.
stuff off and come in?
Could they?
Like switch
AIS.
their trackers off and come in?
Yes.
Where
Yeah.
like boats, even registering one
Yeah.
boat and got stuff in the water?
Yeah, that can happen. And there's ways of looking at that as well. There are radar systems that look for any boat in the ocean, just the metal. And then you can match that up with whether it's got a beacon on or not, and you can find dark vessels that way and say there was a boat, it wasn't on AIS, it was probably doing something illegal. So that's called dark vessel mapping. That can be done as well. That's not something we're doing, but the Marine Management Organisation are doing that here. They'd have to come very close to the island too to affect the distribution of the Galapagos sharks around here, and that would undoubtedly have been observed if there were commercial boats within 12 nautical mile like territorial waters.
Yeah, thanks, mate. So you're talking about like resident shark species, as in Galapagos and silkies. What do you see? Do you see any visiting shark species like tigers and stuff like that? And is there a correlation between when they move around and the other sharks come, or anything like that?
It's a great question. Cheers, Tom. Sam's actually been here, lived here on Ascension for 6 years up till 2016.
Yeah.
And was instrumental in, and I'll let him answer the question, because other species were tagged, tigers and a few others. So
Yeah, I mean, I could list off a whole load of different ones, like tiger sharks inshore, definitely have been here. We've tagged 2 off Ascension. Various species of hammerheads, scallop great hammerheads we've seen here, not many anymore. There used to be more apparently, but they've been observed in small numbers. Blue sharks, lots, but offshore further. Makos we've seen on remote camera systems offshore. There's whale sharks definitely coming through. And then deeper, you've got sharks we don't see so much, like 6-gill sharks and small-tooth sand tiger sharks. So a lot of things moving through.
But are you seeing any correlation between like those visitors and our population?
Oh, I
moving around the
see,
island? Do you see what
yeah.
I'm saying?
The pressure, yeah.
That we don't have monitoring at that granularity. To monitor like those other transient species, as well as the
I just wondered if it was like, you know, you'd seen 3 tigers and
then all the other
everyone
ones,
went the
all
other
the other
side.
scarpa.
Yeah.
We haven't got into we don't have any data on how many of those other species there are. We know they're all here. We see them sporadically on various systems, but we don't know
I guess
their
the only
abundance over time.
the only additional part of that answer is the team over the last few years. We have the 40 odd tagged internally
Yeah.
of Galapagos, but we were fishing like monthly, so our efforts were dispersed around Pillar Bay and other areas of the island, and we were fishing every month throughout the year 2023 and into 2024, and primarily those 2 species, Silky and Galapagos, always were there. Like, and you know when you see something different, it's you know it strikes your eye, and so far, unfortunately, we've only seen 1 6-gill, and that was the other day on a deep water camera system that we were towing. So, it's a great question. Thank you.
And you do know when a tiger's coming when you're underwater sharks. All the little ones take off, and so they do that and definitely avoid predators. But we don't have the data to know.
Yes.
The superpod that you guys showed on the screen, were you guys baiting, or was it just naturally occur?
So there's a few hot spots, as you would have seen, and it's a great question because I always I love pulling up with the boat and looking down and there's a shark there, because you know you got it right when that happens. Because we have gone to several areas, fished in a lot of areas where there was no sharks, and then fished in areas where it was commonly seen that be sharks. And Pillar Bay was one of those. You could literally pull up and see sharks. And the other day was the team came out with us, and we pulled up, and within minutes there's something on the surface, like at the back of the boat. No bait in the water, nothing. I've always maintained a very strict work ethic on the boat of no extra, anything that's on the hook will be what we're fishing for the shark. And it works because we go to where we know the sharks have been in the past. And then times like this where they're distributed all over the place, it's still hit and miss because they do move. But yeah, single line, single hook, and that's the way we fish. So.
It was like an interesting story. I found that school in the first place because when we first came to do this project, there was a lot of sharks around. We heard this. We came, and obviously when we arrived, there were no sharks anywhere around. Essentially, we couldn't find any to tag anywhere for weeks. And then we got this one like random ping from an old tag we put out, like a satellite pinger. Got pinged once from Pillar Bay. We were like, oh, we might as well go and look down there. And we turned up at Pillar Bay and put a GoPro in the water. And it was like, oh my God, there were just tens of thousands under that point, and we didn't know that super school was there until then.
What month would that have been? Would it coincide with the birds, the fledglings? Because I'm assuming where they guano will be food effectively for smaller fish.
As far as we can tell, there is no seasonality to their presence on Pillar Bay at the moment. It can happen at any time of year. That is kind of the default where they all go back to, but it could happen in any month of the year.
The bird activity, because the bird activity is quite constant here, isn't it, as well? I know it does have its seasons, but still on the bird activity.
The peak sort of fledging time for the seabirds will be around like March, April, May. But just like these guys were explaining, like there's no sort of peak in the shark movements that like coincides with what's going on with the birds. But you are right, having the high concentrations of guano will produce much more food for the smaller sort of fish, and there is that knock-on effect. But there doesn't seem to be that relationship between the shark behaviour and the seabird behaviour.
And Pillar Bay is not as birdy as Bosamud Island. And they don't really like it around. The little sharks hang out around Bosamud Island. It's like a nursery for juveniles, But the bigger Galapagos don't seem to be around there so much. They're off in other spots. No, the peaks don't line up with any particular season. Like they seem to be. So far, they've been in any month of the year. They can be at Pillar Bay in any month of the year, and they could be on this side of the island in any month of the year. And it happens very quickly sometimes. They can be on this side for like 2 weeks and then vanish again, and then a month later they can be back again. So there's something that is causing it to flip that isn't like one of the obvious things we might think about. Based on the work that Melo's done on the diet so far, Galapagos sharks are mainly eating things like jacks and grouper, and silky sharks are eating things like tuna and wahoo. So it's those species that we need to be thinking about. When they move, it would make sense for the sharks to move, but we don't really have any good data on what the jack's doing and what the grouper are doing and what the other species that these sharks are after. Maybe there's like a mass spawning event of something happens and they all follow, but we don't know anything about the movements of those species yet. And that would be a really cool thing to know, because then we could start to work our way back a little bit.
Is there a way of you putting like the trackers that close to where people swim, with acoustic like sound or something? So, say if sharks get close, then people know now not to travel and get in the water at that particular time. The sharks are getting plenty.
There is detection devices that can do that. I think there's just a bit of a liability issue with, if you have a siren that goes off, for example, that's of a tagged animal that went past that siren. That's good. But what about the one that's not tagged that also comes in, and then people get confident to swim or use the water, and then there's the issue that it's a liability issue, and it can be. But yeah, you are right. There is devices that will auto detect. You either send a message to a phone, or I think the Great White Network, they sometimes have something that might give an alert to any swimming beaches. It's just Ascension Island is very small, for example. That implemented could cause a few issues. But yeah, you are right. There are devices out there. They just you need to tag the animal and have the device like waiting to detect those animals.
And we are looking at ways to like do something about this and to find ways of making swimming safer. We did a feasibility study as part of the project looking at shark barriers for beaches. There's issues with that we need to like think about for the government, but we've got a good costed study done now, and we can start to think about funding to do that and make safe swimming spaces for people. I know in the consultations we did at the start, that was the number one thing that people on the island would like to have seen done to create a safe swimming space, but it's not super easy to do. There are things that need to be thought about in terms of how suitable they are for Ascension, how they'll be maintained, who will be responsible for doing that, but that process is ongoing, and we'd really like to be able to do something to create a safe space for people during those kind of sharkier periods.
Do you know of any like great whites or stuff that has come to any of those periods?
Not that we know of.
Not yet.
No. We've had no detections. So the only things we've detected are one Almaco jack from Centolina and some other silky and Galapagos sharks from elsewhere that have turned up here, but no other species have come through our array yet.
Well, his great whites not been tagged yet.
They have been tagged, yeah. I mean, you would need to tag potentially a lot of animals to have the chance of suddenly catching one on our array, but as I say, we've never detected one. They have been acoustically tagged in many places, but they've never turned up here as far as we...
So you haven't actually seen none either?
Never seen one here.
Oh, on St. Lane they got this underwater camera system. Yeah, just phones, 360. Is anything swim past it? Did you hear any of that setup on?
Only the pier cam and the Compass Cove camera, like looking onto the water. I'm not too familiar with the one in St. Helena, but we are chatting with St. Helena about a few opportunities going forward. So if something they found works, we'll definitely
because they got one with the buoy and they drop it in with the weights on the bottom, and they can put it at whatever height they want, and no bait or nothing on it, and just foam, and then they look at what they got.
Yeah, I don't think it stays in permanently, does it? It's like a short survey, so you can't have eyes on the water all the time.
Yeah.
So for the pier camera, we're trying to find a system that we could just leave autonomously, like collecting stuff all the time, so we didn't have to have just short-term surveys. And we didn't show any data from that, but that's worked pretty well, hasn't it? The pier in tracking, and they tend to trace what our tag sharks are doing. When that happens, you see them all turn up on the pierhead camera. So we have a couple of ways of measuring kind of activity.
Thank you again for all your attendance, and we'll be back here again next year at the same time.